Have you ever walked into a place of luxury, only to feel instantly that every gaze in the room was cutting you out of the picture? No one has to say a word. A glance from the receptionist, a smirk from another customer, enough to remind you, you don't belong here. That is the quiet pain so many Black people face. Not because they lack talent, money, or status, but because their skin itself becomes a ticket. Always scrutinized, always doubted, even when they hold an entire empire in their hands. But this is not just a story about humiliation at a closed door. This is a story of rising, of how someone turns silence into a weapon, how a look of disdain becomes a mirror reflecting the smallness of those who scorned him. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a shout. It arrives with powerful silence and a smile that forces the whole room to bow its head. And you will see it here, a Black CEO asked to prove ownership of his own company, bringing an entire bank to a dead, suffocating silence. He didn't just prove himself, he flipped the whole story upside down. If you've ever witnessed or lived through a moment like this, leave your mark. Like this video, share it so the story travels further. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell because every week together we expose the hidden corners where the truth about racist injustice must be brought into the light. And now, let's return to that morning. A grand central bank, its marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Customers walked in, draped in expensive suits. And Elijah Brooks, in their eyes, was nothing more than an intruder. The bank towered like a fortress of glass. Its polished facade reflected the entire city, while the massive revolving doors turned slowly, welcoming in expensive suits, gleaming shoes, and leather briefcases swollen with power. Inside, golden light spilled across the marble floors, making every step echo like a declaration. This was no place for the ordinary. Customers walked through the doors, each one playing a role in an elegant play. Some adjusted their ties. Others smiled politely at the uniformed staff, everyone performing the part of belonging. This bank was more than a place to store money. It was a stage for displaying status. And anyone who entered carried with them something invisible. A ticket of recognition, proof they were worthy. And then Elijah Brooks arrived. He wore a modest suit, not flashy with designer labels, but well-tailored. The kind of fabric chosen by a man who never needed a brand name to prove himself. His walk was unhurried, each step measured like someone long accustomed to marble floors and the sharp edge of stairs. Yet to the crowd inside the bank, he appeared as a paradox. A Black man stepping into a space they believed was meant for faces of a different color. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't bow his head in greeting. He looked straight toward the door leading into the VIP section. His eyes were calm, steady, like still water. But to others, that calm read as arrogance. And arrogance from a Black man in this place was something they weren't used to seeing. Behind the reception desk, a young woman in a gray suit lifted her gaze. Her eyes blinked once, then froze on Elijah's face. A moment's hesitation before her cold voice carried across the room, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Sorry, sir. The VIP section is not for you. Please use the regular counter over there." The words seemed light, casual, but their weight struck the air like metal on stone. A few customers tilted their heads, sneaking glances, whispering to one another. An older man with salt and pepper hair let out a quiet chuckle, the kind of laugh reserved for a joke that doesn't even need a punchline. Elijah stopped at the threshold. Light reflected across his face. No anger, no argument. Just silence. A silence that stretched long enough for the room to anticipate a reaction. But he didn't move toward the regular line. He stood there as though testing the door itself to see if it was truly locked, or if fear was what had closed it. In that silence, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze locked on the receptionist. Not pleading, but reminding her, "One day you'll open this door for me. Not because I begged, because I belong here." To an outsider, it might have looked like a minor incident, an employee's mistake, a trivial misunderstanding. But no one realized This was only the first piece of a chain reaction that would leave the entire bank in stunned silence. And when his name appeared in their files, the laughter in this room would echo again, but not in the way they expected it. Elijah's eyes stayed fixed on the VIP entrance. The receptionist, her stiff smile plastered on her face, repeated herself, this time firmer, sharper, as though he hadn't heard her clearly the first time. Sir, the VIP section is for special clients only. You need to use the regular counter. The phrase special clients landed like a label being slapped on Elijah, marking him as not enough, not refined enough, not the right color to belong. Nearby, more customers began paying attention. Some looked him over from head to toe, weighing every stitch of his suit. A young woman in a fur coat whispered to her companion, her tilted smile suggesting she was watching someone stumble into a place that clearly wasn't theirs. But Elijah remained still. No step back, no step forward. He simply set his leather case on the desk, slowly, deliberately, the way a stone is laid onto the ground. His composure made the situation more unbearable, forcing those who wanted to laugh louder, covering their own discomfort. The receptionist's patience cracked. She leaned forward, her voice sharper now. Did you not hear me? The regular line is right there. This is not a place to... Wait! The word wait hung in the air like a knife. No need to spell it out. The implication was enough. And anyone listening could see the cruel paradox. A black CEO running an entire company, pushed aside as if he were not special enough. Elijah raised his head slowly, meeting her eyes. No anger, no shouting. His gaze was calm to the point of unsettling, as if he were watching a play that had been performed too many times. A thin smile crossed his lips, no more than a thread. You're right, this is not a place to wait. The response made her freeze just for a moment. The room, expecting an outburst, instead had to sit with a silence edged with irony. Even the older man's chuckle faltered, hanging awkwardly in the air. Elijah opened his case, pulled out a file, and laid it flat on the counter. White paper, black ink, his name printed bold across the top. Elijah Brooks, owner Collins Group. No one spoke. The silence landed heavy, so thick you could hear the footsteps of someone entering through the revolving doors behind them. The truth sat there, plain and undeniable, but instead of resolving the standoff, it cracked open something deeper. Sometimes the truth is too large to be acknowledged. The receptionist frowned, glanced down at the file, then back up at him with a flicker of defiance. The performance wasn't over. It was only beginning. If she thought blocking a black man at the door would be enough, she had no idea what was coming next. The game she thought was hers to control would spiral into suspicion, mockery, and public humiliation. But not for Elijah. For them. He stood in the golden light reflected off the marble floor. His papers lay flat on the counter, but it was the silence that carried more weight than any seal or signature. And in that silence, memories returned. Doors slamming shut in his face again and again across a lifetime. He remembered the first time, as a boy, when his mother brought him into a department store. She asked about a face cream at the cosmetics counter. The woman behind it never looked at her, only said coldly, "Those products aren't meant for your skin." He was just a child, but he never forgot the look in his mother's eyes. Not anger, resignation. A woman, too, used to being excluded. Then came college. Wearing a borrowed suit to a recruiting event, Elijah walked up to the registration desk. The clerk glanced at his name, then pointed down the hallway toward the janitorial staff. "Over there, that's your room." One gesture, one arrogant mistake, turned a top student into an outsider in an instant. And now, here he was again, the script replaying itself. The VIP door before him wasn't just wood and glass. It was built from layers of bias, layers of stairs. But this time, Elijah wasn't the bewildered boy, nor the humiliated student. He had walked through too many slammed doors to know the truth. Sometimes the strongest response is to take one more step forward, no matter how hard they try to hold you back. He drew a slow breath, then moved just a slightly forward, his shoe striking the marble with a clear, echoing sound. The noise carried, bouncing back as if the building itself had no choice but to acknowledge his presence. His eyes gave no plea, no request for permission. They held a reminder too sharp to be ignored. This door will open, not because I asked, because I belong. The receptionist flinched at the force of his gaze. A few customers stopped smiling. Something in Elijah's silence unsettled them. They had expected anger, an outburst they could dismiss as losing control. But this calm, this silence was far more dangerous. In that silence, Elijah was not standing only for himself. He stood for every moment someone had been stopped, for every door that had slammed in the face of those who looked like him. And that silence, once set down, weighed more than any shout ever could. The room grew restless. The receptionist frowned. A manager reached for his phone. Heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. They thought stopping a man at the door was a small game, a brief distraction. But they had no idea. The game they'd started would end with them, not Elijah as the ones exposed. The sound of the file landing on the desk cracked through the air, dry and final like a knock on the door of truth. White pages neatly stacked, black ink edged into every line. Nothing flashy, just fact. Elijah Brooks, owner Collins Group. His name printed bold, so clear it could not be mistaken. The receptionist froze. Her eyes darted from the name on the page to Elijah's face, then back again, as though staring long enough might make it disappear. But it didn't. It stayed. It refused to blur, refused to be erased, refused to ask permission to exist. Behind him, a few customers leaned closer. An old man in a pinstriped suit adjusted his glasses, smothering a laugh as he skimmed the name. A young woman whispered into her friend's ear, her tone dripping with disdain. He just wrote his name on company papers? That's all it takes? The laughter spread, thin, brittle, rattling through the room like wind across dry fields. In that moment, Elijah's name was no longer just ink on paper. It became an object of dissection, too big for them to swallow, too heavy to accept, yet too undeniable to refute. And so, instead of recognizing it, they laughed. Elijah stood still, eyes resting on the file as though he were reading his own life condensed into a handful of pages. Years of study, countless business deals, nights at negotiation tables where power strutted around like it owned the world. All of it condensed into one name, a name that, in this moment, they deemed too big to belong to a black man. The receptionist regained her composure, but her voice wavered, losing its earlier smoothness. "Do you even have any other proof, sir? This information will need to be verified. Other proof?" Elijah raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest smirk. In front of her were notarized documents, red stamps, signatures. If that wasn't proof, what could be? But he didn't answer right away. He knew they weren't looking for truth. They were looking for a reason to deny it. The salt and pepper man behind him let out a laugh, loud and deliberate. "I've seen plenty of tricks, but this is the first time I've seen someone claim to own an entire corporation." Impressive. More chuckles followed. Not because it was funny, but because it gave them cover to indulge their prejudice. In their eyes, Elijah could not possibly be the owner, which meant any evidence in his hands must be nothing more than theater. Elijah drew in a long breath, letting the noise ripple around him. Inside, it wasn't anger that flared, but something colder, irony. They're not laughing because they know I'm wrong. They're laughing because they're afraid I might be right. In this room, his name on legal papers wasn't enough to open the door. But Elijah knew. It wouldn't be long before that same name turned into the only key they couldn't ignore. The banker flipped through a few pages of the file, her brows knitting, her lips tightening, as if she had discovered something suspicious. She looked up at him, her expression caught between doubt and mockery. "You're the owner of Collins Group? I'm sorry, but with just this, we'll need additional proof." Additional proof. The phrase landed like a trap, already set. What lay before her, stamps, signatures, corporate seals, suddenly didn't count. Everything tied to power and legitimacy was dismissed simply because it bore the name Elijah Brooks. A black man. A scoff cut through from across the room. A woman draped in a fur coat leaned toward her friend, voice pitched just high enough to carry, "Imagine, a black man calling himself the owner of a corporation." The ripple of laughter grew louder, swelling into the kind of chorus that turned a procedure into public humiliation. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at what they believed was a fraud that perfectly aligned with the story they wanted to believe. Elijah didn't move. He let the laughter hang, each sharp note scraping against his skin but never breaking through. He knew the mockery wasn't truly about him. It was about the image they refused to accept. A black man crossing a line they believed was never meant to be crossed. The banker tapped her pen against the desk, her voice steady but loaded. "Sir, we'll need additional documents. Perhaps a shareholder letter. Or at least something from your board of directors. With only this file, we cannot proceed." The words sliced sharp, designed to corner him. Without more, they could force him to turn away. And to the watching crowd, that turn would be proof that he was a fraud. The old man chuckled again, louder this time, savoring the spectacle. These days, anyone can print a stack of papers. But to claim ownership of a corporation? Come on. The laughter was fuller now, cascading through the room. This grand bank had transformed into a cheap theater, and Elijah, the unwilling actor, was shoved into the spotlight. The audience, each of them, believed they knew the ending. But Elijah's eyes never left the banker. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He simply leaned forward, one solid hand pressing down on the file, as if to say, "This is not paper. This is truth." His silence hit harder than words. The laughter faltered, thinning out, replaced by a hush of anticipation. They waited. Would he snap, walk away, or keep humiliating himself in their eyes? Elijah closed his eyes briefly, breathing deep. That old pain rose again, the pain of carrying a name too large for others to accept. But this time he had no intention of stepping back. And in a few seconds, the entire room would realize they had just laughed at the very truth they were too afraid to believe. Elijah straightened, his back firm against the chair, as though the weight of the room itself leaned on his spine. The laughter hadn't fully died. Bits of it still flickered, thin and nervous like oil spreading across water. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing to reassure themselves that he couldn't possibly be real. He drew another slow breath, eyes closing for a beat. In the silence that followed, a thought crystallized. They don't laugh because they know the truth. They laugh because they fear it could exist. He'd seen that same laugh for years. The professor who once told him, smiling, "Men like you should pick a more realistic career." The banker a decade ago who chuckled when Elijah, then a young entrepreneur, asked for a loan. They hadn't laughed because his ideas were absurd. They laughed because admitting he might succeed would shatter their worldview. Elijah opened his eyes. The file sat before him like a mirror, reflecting back his entire journey. Late-night deals, grueling negotiations, nights spent alone staring down boardrooms of icy faces. All of it condensed into these pages, and now these people treated it as a stage prop in a cheap performance. His lips curled slightly, not a smile but a silent blade of irony. How strange that his name, bold, notarized, stamped, could be treated as worthless, while their baseless laughter carried the weight of truth. He wondered, how many times had people like him lived this paradox? How many times did truth have to prove itself, while lies needed only a nod to be believed? And how long until the jeering stopped? Elijah's gaze swept the room. The woman in the fur coat avoided his eyes, her smile clinging like a mask. The old man leaned back smugly, arms folded, waiting for him to break. Even the banker clutched her pen, hands trembling slightly as though her authority was slipping. Elijah said nothing. He let silence grow until it pressed against the walls, until every heartbeat in the room seemed to sync with his own. And in that silence, a shift became clear. He was no longer the one on trial. They were. Each face was exposing itself inch by inch under the weight of its own fear. He exhaled slowly, sitting taller, his gaze no longer pleading, no longer explanatory. It was a reminder. Truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to exist, and when it does, it silences everything else. The room sank into a heavy stillness. But it didn't last, because the next sound came. Footsteps, firm and deliberate, carrying authority. The branch manager was approaching, and with him, a new act in the play, one far crueler than the last. The footsteps echoed steadily across the marble floor, slow, deliberate, measured as if each strike had been choreographed to demand attention. Every gaze in the room turned toward the inner door, where a middle-aged man emerged. The branch manager. His suit gleamed black, his tie knotted with precision, his shoes polished so sharply they reflected the ceiling lights. Yet what shifted the atmosphere wasn't his appearance. It was the half-smile etched on his face, a smile no one could mistake for friendliness. That smile both acknowledged and dismissed. Both recognized Elijah's presence and reminded the room that he didn't belong. It was the smile of someone who had lived too long inside the comfort of power, a man who knew the weight leaned in his favor and savored the moment of watching another push to the edge. Elijah didn't move. He let the manager approach, each step pounding the invisible boundary between owner and guest, between those who belong and those who do not. With every strike of leather against stone, the room grew tighter. The murmurs stilled until the air itself waited for judgment. The manager stopped at the counter, his eyes flicking over the file as if it were nothing more than a stack of meaningless pages, before settling on Elijah. He gave a small nod, polite enough to play the role, but stripped of any respect. His voice was low, steady, heavy with a pointed subtext. "Good afternoon, I hear you're claiming to be the owner of Collins Group?" It wasn't a question. It was an insinuation. Each word carried a polished sneer, careful not to cross into open insult, but sharp enough for the entire room to share in the smirk. Elijah tilted his head slightly, eyes fixed on the man. He didn't answer. He let the silence expand, forcing the manager to sit in the shadow of his own words. The man's smile crept higher, thin and cutting, like a knife hidden behind manners. A few customers leaned forward, eager for the next line. The manager's entrance had transformed the lobby into a stage, Elijah cast beneath the spotlight. The truth didn't matter to them. What they wanted was theater, and the branch manager, with his measured steps and razor smile, was the director they'd been waiting for. Elijah sat still, a familiar chill coiling in his chest. The cold certainty that this wasn't about procedure, it was performance, a public framing, the kind that pinned a man in place with nothing more than words, spoken lightly but weighted like a sentence. The room held its breath. The manager's next words wouldn't stop at doubt. They would strike deeper, clean and casual, a blade dressed as bureaucracy. The man slipped a phone from his suit pocket, slow and deliberate, as though he had the whole afternoon to stage this scene. He didn't lower his voice as professionalism demanded. Instead, he raised it, performing, projecting, so every person in the marble chamber could hear each syllable. "Hello, headquarters? I've got a black man here claiming to be a CEO, trying to push through a multi-million transaction. Do you want me to call security now?" The words rang down the marble walls, hard as stone, echoing like a public indictment. A black man, drawn out, underlined in tone, smeared across the air like ink blotting over truth. And in an instant, the lobby became a gallery. Some customers exchanged glances, lips curling with vindication as though their suspicions had just been confirmed. Others bent toward each other, whispering, relishing the license to mock. One man seated near the counter even snorted aloud, muttering just loud enough. "Told you, a joke." Elijah sat upright, his face calm, but inside his chest, old memories surged. He remembered standing as a teenager beside his mother in a supermarket, when a clerk stopped her, demanding she open her purse to prove she hadn't stolen. They had spoken loud, deliberately loud, for everyone in line to hear. And now, here it was again. Same script, new stage. Yesterday a grocery store, today a bank. The manager paced with the phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying high, drowning out the room. Yes, he has papers, but they don't look legitimate. No, he doesn't look like a CEO at all. Should I hold him here or have him escorted out? The whispers swelled into a tide. No security guard had yet arrived, but the atmosphere had already turned courtroom. Elijah was no longer a client. He was the defendant of an unwritten trial, and his crime was daring to exist in their presence with ownership on his name. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He let every word hang, let the room expose itself. He knew shouting would only seal the theater, make the humiliation complete. Instead, his silence turned the shame around. Each word from the manager no longer stained Elijah. It stained the man performing so eagerly for an audience. A few faces shifted. Not everyone was laughing. Some caught the sharp edge in the manager's tone and saw it for what it was. But they stayed quiet, choosing the safety of numbers over the weight of truth. The call ended. The manager slipped the phone back into his pocket, his face momentarily glowing with satisfaction. The look of a man who believed he had delivered the scene's climax. Elijah remained motionless, not angry, not bowed. His gaze rested in the middle distance, letting silence drape over him like armor. A silence that would, soon enough, sharpen into the blade that turned the entire room upside down. For Elijah knew, every word the manager had just spoken would not vanish into the air. They would return, relentless, when the truth broke open. And the man who performed so confidently today would be the one haunted by his own voice. Elijah heard every syllable, each one sinking deep. A black man claiming to be a CEO, spoken so smoothly as if reporting an obvious fact. But to Elijah, it was the echo of hundreds of humiliations past. Memories surged again. His mother in her floral dress at the supermarket checkout, being told in a voice loud enough for the entire line, "You're in the wrong section. This isn't for housemaids." Elijah, a boy then, hadn't understood all the words, but the sting of humiliation had burned itself into his skin. 2 decades later, he had believed success, wealth, and status might silence those moments. But here they were, returning bare and brazen. Only this time, he wasn't a boy watching in silence. Elijah's hand clenched until veins rose against his skin. A flicker of rage rose, but he forced it back down. Only one word pulsed in his mind. Again. Again, not as a complaint, but as a record. The same play performed over and over, the stage simply shifting. Supermarket, lecture hall, job interview, bank. They thought a change of scenery disguised it, but the script was always the same. Deny, diminish, discredit. Because what they feared most was the possibility that a man like Elijah truly existed. He lifted his face, eyes fixed on the space between him and the manager. No plea, no confusion. Only a cold message carried in the steadiness of his gaze. You can try to humiliate me. You cannot erase me. The laughter began to taper off. No one could explain why, but his silence pressed heavy against the room. They waited for him to break, to rage, to storm out, anything to justify their sneers. But Elijah gave them nothing. Instead, his stillness forced them to hear their own empty laughter reverberating back at them. He didn't need to shout the truth. Some truths are heaviest in silence. And in that weight, the shame shifted, inch by inch, from his shoulders to theirs. In that moment, Elijah understood. He didn't need to defend himself. All he had to do was wait. Wait until the truth itself shattered the walls of pretense, the way light slices through even the smallest crack. The manager thought he held control, thought the reins were firm in his hands. But Elijah knew better. The man's own words had already cut the mask from his face, and when it fell, the whole room would bear witness to the reversal. The heavy thud of boots on marble echoed through the room, each step like a gavel striking the heartbeat of the chamber. 2 broad-shouldered security guards peeled away from the far wall, striding forward with mechanical certainty. They didn't need to speak. Their very presence was enough to turn the air into a silent indictment. The customers straightened in their seats. Some leaned forward, craning for a better view. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to anticipation, like theatergoers waiting for the climax. No one cared whether Elijah's transaction was legitimate. What mattered to them was the spectacle now taking shape. A black man about to be escorted out of the bank's VIP section. The guards advanced, their footsteps pounding against the marble and reverberating off the high ceiling, the sound of authority amplified. One, tall and broad, let his cold eyes sweep over the file on the desk before fixing on Elijah. It wasn't a questioning look. It was an order. The other tilted his chin upward, a practiced gesture of men used to signaling who did and didn't belong. Elijah sat motionless, his hands resting on his thighs, his gaze straight ahead. He didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't retreat. His composure clashed against the taut air around him. In that room, he did not look like a man causing trouble. He looked like someone quietly watching a play scripted to humiliate him. A derisive laugh cut the silence. The gray-haired man in the corner, the one who had mocked all along, leaned back with satisfaction. Looks like somebody's Uber driver got lost," he said loudly enough to carry across the lobby. A ripple of laughter followed, cheap and eager, like an audience fed a punchline they'd been waiting for. Elijah didn't turn. He had lived too many years with words sharpened into weapons, too many times reduced to a joke in rooms that pretended not to hear their own malice. He let the words pass, like stones skipping across a wide lake, rippling for a moment before sinking into nothing. The guards stopped in front of him, their shadows cutting across the polished floor. One leaned slightly down, his voice lowered but still loud enough for others to hear. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave. The bank doesn't allow disturbances." Disturbance. The word fell lightly, but its weight was immense. Elijah hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lifted a hand. His only crime was sitting there. And still his presence had already been branded as disruption. He met the man's eyes without blinking. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't rise. He set down silence instead, heavier than any protest. The room held its breath. Those eager for chaos leaned in, waiting for the outburst, convinced the moment of rage was finally here. But what was coming wasn't anger. It was something quieter and far more unsettling. Silence that could make a room bow. The Uber joke still lingered like a slap disguised as humor. A few chuckles sputtered, not because it was funny, but because it gave permission to humiliate him. Yet Elijah's refusal to react turned the laughter into something else, something brittle. Their own cruelty began to echo back at them, exposed in the stillness. Slowly, the laughter thinned, leaving behind an awkward hush. The guards loomed closer, their bodies a wall of muscle between him and the room. One bent toward him, his square jaw tight, his voice clipped and cold. "Stand up, sir. You need to leave. Now." The word now cracked like a whip in the air. Elijah's lips curved, just barely. Not in amusement, but in irony. Without a word spoken, without a single act of defiance, he had already been cast as the problem. Disturbance, threat, ruckus. All for the simple act of existing where he wasn't expected. Meanwhile, the jeers and sneers that actually fractured the peace went unchecked. He raised his head, his eyes calm, almost serene. He wasn't staring to intimidate. He was holding up a mirror. His gaze said what his mouth did not. "You call me a disturbance only because I don't fit the picture you've drawn for yourselves." From behind, another customer added fuel. "That's right, he's been sitting here too long. Doesn't belong. Why hasn't he been removed yet?" The words caught like kindling, feeding the mob's need for a verdict. The lobby turned tribunal. Judge, jury, and executioner, disguised as everyday bankers and clients, declaring Elijah guilty without evidence. The guard repeated the command, sharper this time, his patience thinning. "Sir, on your feet, out." Elijah sat upright, his back straight, his palms pressed lightly to the table. His fingers tapped out a slow rhythm, each knock on the polished wood, pulling eyes back to him. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, and in that beat, they noticed something. The man wasn't afraid. His calmness was sharper than resistance. The silence stretched, broken only by the guard's heavy breathing. The room expected Elijah to rise in shame, to storm out, to give them the ending they thought they deserved. But he didn't move. His stillness became a dare. If you want me gone, drag me. Show the world how frightened you are of a man who simply sits still. Behind them, the manager smirked. He thought he had won. He thought the sight of security hauling Elijah out would close the curtain. But Elijah wasn't a man whose story ended in the middle of a play. Because what was coming wasn't an exit. It was a reversal. And in minutes, the very silence they mocked would cut sharper than any shout. The guard stood over him, their broad shoulders blotting the light. Elijah didn't look them in the eyes. His gaze swept past them, cool as wind, unsettling in its gentleness. Men used to seeing fear in others found only their own unease reflected back. Inside, Elijah recalled his mother's words. You don't have to win every argument, son. You only need to stand firm long enough for the truth to show itself. As a boy, he hadn't understood. But here, in this bank lobby, with laughter fading and eyes restless, he finally did. The truth was simple. His name was on the documents. His power sat in the ink of a signature. And this bank soon enough would not belong to those laughing. He didn't need to shout it. Time would say it for him. And when it did, those clamoring for his removal would be the witnesses to their own undoing. Elijah exhaled, steady and deliberate, his hands still resting on the table. The sound drew the room deeper into the silence. A cough here, a chair creaking there, tiny sounds of discomfort rising in a crowd that suddenly realized they'd lost the rhythm of the scene. They'd expected collapse. Instead, he sat taller than before. And in that stillness, Elijah became more than one man. He became every black man ever told to leave, every black woman ever questioned at the door, every child ever misnamed and misplaced. Only this time, instead of walking away, he remained. And that presence, unyielding, undeniable, was the loudest declaration of all. The guards waited. The manager smirked. The crowd fidgeted. But Elijah knew the play hadn't even begun. And when it did, laughter would be the first casualty. The air in the room was so heavy you could hear every breath. Every eye was fixed on Elijah as though he were a fuse waiting for a spark. They all knew the script. A black man humiliated in public would eventually lose control, shout, lash out in anger. And the moment he did, they'd have their excuse. See? We were right. The gray-haired man in the corner leaned forward, eager for the explosion. The receptionist behind the counter gripped her pen tighter, her eyes flickering. Not just with nerves, but with a secret wish for chaos, so she could justify the insult. The two guards stood tense as bowstrings, waiting for him to rise so they could slam him back down. The whole room was a stage, each minor character already in place. All that was missing was the main act, Elijah's reaction. The ticking of the wall clock pressed the moment, beat by beat, as if daring him to move. But Elijah didn't shout. He didn't leap to his feet. Instead, the corner of his mouth curved, a smile. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't a mask for fury. It was a blade-thin smile sharp enough to slice the tension itself. And for a heartbeat, confusion swept the room. The crowd that had braced for rage suddenly had nothing to hold on to. The gray-haired man furrowed his brow, forcing a weak chuckle to cover his hesitation. The receptionist stared harder at the file, desperate for a mistake to cling to. One of the guards darted a glance at the other, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. No one had planned for this, Elijah smiling. That smile inside the silence thundered louder than any yell. It said, without sound, I know what you want, and I refuse to give it to you. The room lost its rhythm. Instead of glee, doubt crept in. What is he thinking, they wondered. How can he smile, surrounded, degraded in front of us all? That smile didn't just surprise them. It unsettled them. It seeded fear. Elijah's eyes drifted across the room, light as a brushstroke, as though he were examining a dull painting. No hatred, no fury, only a quiet irony. And in that look, those who had laughed began to realize they were the clowns. And then, in the hush, Elijah spoke. Just one word. Interesting. The single word dropped like iron. He didn't explain. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of it transformed their contempt into something flimsy, absurd. The room froze. No one knew if he was mocking them, warning them, or preparing something greater. But everyone sensed it. This wasn't an ending. This was the start of a reversal that would force the bank to bow. His smile lingered only a breath, but its echo cut deeper than a scream. The laughter died into coughs, into awkward shuffling. Instead of the explosion they'd anticipated, they got silence sharpened into a weapon. Did he just smile? Someone muttered, voice trembling between shock and unease. Because Elijah's smile wasn't for their comfort, it was a mirror. It reflected every sneer, every cheap laugh, twisting them back onto the faces that had worn them. The gray-haired man frowned, his mockery sour in his throat. He had been waiting to see a man unravel, to confirm his prejudice in real time. But all he saw now was calm defiance. And against that, his own laughter felt ridiculous. The receptionist couldn't look away. The smile pinned her in place, flipping the roles. She was the one being judged now, not him. Her pen hovered uselessly over the desk. Even the guards faltered. They'd been trained for shouting, for shoving, for chaos. But no one had trained them for silence paired with a smile. You can't wrestle a smile to the ground. You can't muscle calm into submission. For the first time, one of them blinked, breaking his stare. Elijah remained still, his hands resting lightly on the table. He didn't need to speak further. The silence surrounding his smile said everything. I don't need to yell for you to see how small you've become. Somewhere near the back, a young woman pulled her arm from her companions. Her eyes lingered on Elijah, not with ridicule, but with respect. She said nothing, but her gaze betrayed the crowd. Not everyone thought this farce was amusing anymore. In that moment, Elijah owned the tempo. He didn't need a badge or muscle or the mob's approval. One smile had handed him the reins, and suddenly, it was the room that seemed trapped. And in every mind hung the same uneasy question. If he can smile in this moment, then what else is he holding back? The silence stretched, his smile fading, but its weight still pressing down like ink, spreading across water. Faces warped beneath it. Mockery looked hollow. Jokes sounded cruel, not clever. Sometimes a smile is the mirror that forces others to see their own pettiness. Elijah knew it. He watched the unease spread. The gray-haired man stroked his mustache, trying to disguise his discomfort. The receptionist's hands froze, her pen trembling in the air. Even the guards standing stiff suddenly felt like statues. Hulking, yes, but meaningless in the stillness. Elijah didn't rush. He didn't argue. He let the silence argue for him. In that silence, every laugh replayed in the minds of those who had laughed. And this time, it didn't sound triumphant. It sounded pathetic. He sat unmoved, and it was the crowd that grew restless. They had expected rage, collapse, a spectacle. But Elijah denied them. He made them wait. And in the waiting, they realized their unease was growing. If he doesn't break, what is he about to do? Elijah's gaze skimmed the room, pausing only for a heartbeat on each face. No words, just the stare, and the residue of that smile was enough to make them squirm. Predators weren't used to prey grinning back. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded lightly, his smile gone but its aftertaste heavy. The silence hung on, filled now with dread. Because deep down, they all knew this was only the beginning. And Elijah? He was ready. He'd been through too many rooms like this, too many tests of patience masked as jokes. He knew every show needs a climax, and sometimes the smartest move is to let your opponents set the stage themselves. He closed his eyes for a fleeting second, reminding himself, this wasn't just about him. This was about every black man ever forced to smile when doubted, every black woman ever stopped at the door, every child misnamed and misplaced. Tonight, his smile was the signal, the opening act of a reckoning they never saw coming. No one in the room looked away now. They couldn't. He had bound them to his stillness. And in that grip of silence, something began to stir. Something no one had predicted. Because Elijah still held a card none of them had seen, a single move that would unravel the entire farce in one stroke. The click of the briefcase lock snapped open, sharp and final, like the drumbeat announcing the start of a new act. In the stillness of the room, that small sound made several people flinch. Every eye turned to the table where Elijah placed the leather case neatly in front of him, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, as if an artist preparing his instrument before the performance. No one knew what lay inside. Some assumed he would pull out more fake papers, clinging to a pride they thought was already crumbling. Others believed it was just a stall tactic before security dragged him out. What no one expected was the truth. They had grown used to stories of pretended power, never the real thing. Elijah didn't rush. His fingers brushed across a stack of documents, then drew one out. White paper, black ink, crisp and formal. He laid it on the table gently but firmly for all to see. The overhead lights glinted off the glass surface, making the words shine. His name appeared again, Elijah Brooks. No longer meaningless letters in their eyes, but undeniable proof that his presence here was not random. Silence. The whispers died. Tension thickened. Those who had laughed suddenly found it harder to swallow. They hadn't expected the truth, but now it sat in front of them, daring them to deny it. Elijah lifted his gaze, sweeping the room. He didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't plead. Placing the documents alone was declaration enough. In that moment, he wasn't the one on trial. He was the one holding up a mirror to their mistaken assumptions. A man shifted in his chair, coughing to fill the silence. The gray-haired heckler raised his eyebrows, smirked, but the smirk bent crooked on his lips. The receptionist bent over the files, searching desperately for a flaw. But the more she looked, the clearer the truth became. The guards stood solid, but their eyes flickered. They had been summoned to deal with a troublemaker. But what stood before them now was not an imposter. It was a man with enough evidence to flip the entire balance of the room. Elijah laid down another stack. The thud of paper on glass rang louder than footsteps. Each page carried more than ink. It carried labor, sacrifice, a lifetime of proving the obvious. Then, just as the first papers had begun to choke off the laughter, his hand dipped back into the case. Slowly, deliberately. He withdrew another thick dossier, placed it squarely before him, and spread it open. It wasn't proof of his title as CEO, it was the contract for the acquisition of the bank itself. The bank's logo stamped across the top, the crimson seal of the finance board, signature still fresh with ink. Elijah turned the first page and slid it outward so all could see. This bank now belonged to Collins Group. The silence was absolute. The tick of the wall clock sounded like a hammer striking iron. No one laughed. No one breathed too loud. Even the guards froze, their posture faltering as if the ground had slipped away beneath their boots. The branch manager, who had just minutes ago mocked Elijah into the phone, stood stiff as stone. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He had staged the room as his theater, making Elijah the fool. Now he was the extra in a tragedy of his own making. Elijah tapped the line with his finger. Transfer of ownership. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That small gesture alone declared, "I am not your client. I am your future." The final document landed heavy as steel. And the room, once brimming with smug laughter, had only one truth left. Power had already changed hands. Elijah raised his head, his eyes catching each face. Some lowered theirs, some turned away. But every one of them understood. The performance was over. And they had played the role of mockers, only to become witnesses to their own undoing. One question hung in the silence. What would Elijah say to end this deadly quiet? He sat with his hand resting on the thick stack like a judge with his gavel. No need for speeches. The truth towered on the table in black and red ink. He let his gaze sweep the room slowly. And in that hush, one thought rang in his mind. When a man is forced to prove what is already true, the proof itself becomes the strike. The strike needed no shouting, no fist on the table. It lived in signatures, seals, contracts laid bare. Elijah didn't need to scream, "I am the owner." The papers had screamed it for him, and their weight was crushing. His eyes locked on the manager, the man who had turned the crowd into his audience for ridicule. The man's face had drained to chalk, the half-smile gone, replaced by the hollow stare of someone who had cut himself with his own words. Elijah didn't need to repeat those words. Everyone had heard them, and now they burned with shame, not for Elijah, but for the man who spoke them. The receptionist's hands trembled as she laid her pen down, the rhythm of authority gone. Her smirk dissolved into the tight-lipped confusion of someone realizing she had been the prop in a humiliating skit. Elijah didn't scold. He let silence do it. He knew once truth is placed on the table, it exposes on its own. Every lowered gaze, every swallowed laugh was proof the strike had landed. He exhaled slowly, not from relief but from control. His thought was steady. They wanted me to rage, to lose control. But I don't need to. I just need them to see how small they are next to the truth. The truth, bound in paper, had flipped the stage. The accused had become the judge. The mocked had become the mirror. Elijah tapped the table softly, steady beats echoing in the silence. No one laughed. No one looked up. The papers no longer seemed like paper, but steel plates weighing on every chest. He sat taller, his eyes gleaming, letting silence finish the work. But in his mind he knew this wasn't the final crescendo, because truth had one more face left to reveal, and when it showed, the entire bank would tremble. The room now felt like an abandoned cathedral. The ticking of the wall clock was so sharp you could almost hear each tooth of the gear turning. No one laughed, no one whispered. Every eye, eyes that had doubted, mocked, dismissed, was fixed on a single man, Elijah Brooks. He sat upright, one hand resting lightly on the stack of documents spread across the table like slabs of stone. Each word, each seal, each signature reflected back the arrogance of the entire room, exposing the farce they had all just played a part in. Elijah didn't need to speak. His silence alone was suffocating. The branch manager, who minutes earlier had strutted with bravado on the phone, now stood frozen. Sweat beaded faintly on his forehead, his eyes blinking too often. He knew the room's gaze had shifted, not to Elijah, but to him. He had turned the bank into a theater, only to end up a supporting character in his own tragedy. The receptionist lowered her head, her fingers clamping the pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to write, to move, to do something to escape. But there was nothing left to record. The truth lay bare on the table, leaving no space for pretense. The two guards, once towering as moving walls of authority, now looked like misplaced statues. Still standing, but stripped of purpose. Their presence only made the room feel smaller, more uneasy. Elijah shifted slightly. His gaze moved slowly from corner to corner, sweeping the room. As his eyes passed, each person felt exposed to the marrow. Those who had laughed now looked down. Those who had sneered pressed their lips shut, praying his eyes would not linger too long on them. And in that moment, Elijah understood a simple truth. Truth never needs to argue. It only needs to be set down. Its presence alone forces the arrogant to bow. He let the silence stretch one beat longer. Then in a voice deep and steady he spoke. "There's no need to call headquarters." Head snapped up, eyes widened. Elijah paused, letting the words settle before finishing. "From today forward, I am headquarters." The words dropped like a boulder, shaking the entire room. Some gasped, some froze, eyes bulging. The manager stood rigid, as if his legs had been cut out from under him. Elijah's declaration didn't just end the argument, it ended the illusion of power the room had clung to all along. And the bitterest irony? Those who had mocked him were now unwilling witnesses to a truth greater than themselves. The words echoed like a church bell. No need to call headquarters. From today forward, I am headquarters. No shouting, no theatrics, just the calm weight of fact, each syllable hitting like a hammer, collapsing the last walls of arrogance. For a few seconds, no one moved. Every eye was locked on Elijah's face as though they needed time to process what they had just heard. The manager's mouth fell open, then snapped shut again, like a fish tossed onto dry land, gasping for water. The gray-haired man who had mocked him again and again gripped the armrest tight. His smirk was gone, replaced by the awkward mask of shame. Anger flickered in his eyes, but beneath it lived humiliation, because he knew he had applauded a play in which the man he despised was the only one left standing. The receptionist dropped her pen. It rolled across the counter with a sharp clatter, piercing the silence. She tried to force a smile, but her face twisted, betraying the awkwardness of someone who once played gatekeeper and now looked like a fool. The guards remained, but their authority drained away. One glanced at the other, silently asking, "What do we do now?" They had been called to escort out a troublemaker, but before them now stood not a troublemaker, but the new owner of the building itself. The air shifted. A cough broke out, not from discomfort, but to mask embarrassment. Some customers turned their faces toward their phones, pretending distraction, but their reddened ears betrayed the shame of having laughed at the truth. The glee of moments before curdled into exposure. Elijah didn't need to add another word. He sat calmly, letting the truth do the work, stripping masks, bending smirks, silencing arrogance. In that moment, silence was not emptiness, it was absolute power. The manager opened his mouth, but the sound caught in his throat. He knew anything he said now would only deepen the humiliation. Elijah had laid down not just papers, but a statement no one could refute. The farce was over, and the entire stage was his. The room still hadn't recovered. They knew they had just witnessed a reversal that could never be undone. And beneath their stunned eyes, a new question surfaced. If he could do this here, what else could he do out there? Elijah sat motionless like a statue, yet his presence alone held the room hostage. He didn't need to shout or rage. True power never has to be loud. It resided in a single sentence, spoken calmly, that cut deeper than any outburst. No need to call headquarters. From today forward, I am headquarters. For Elijah, those words weren't just a declaration. They were the sum of a lifetime, of doors slammed shut, of mocking laughter, of suspicious stares, of being told to prove himself again and again. Every time he swallowed his pride, every time he endured in silence, he had whispered to himself, "One day the truth will cut them deeper than anger ever could." And now it had. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't need to turn the room into a battlefield. He let silence do the punishing. Each person, from the manager to the receptionist, from the guards to the customers, carried away wounds Elijah never had to inflict. Wounds that would linger, invisible but sharp. His gaze was steady, calm. In his mind, his mother's face flickered. The day she was called a lost housemaid in a supermarket. She had only bitten her lip, held young Elijah close, and whispered, "You don't need to shout to prove your worth. One day, your truth will do it for you." That day had come. Every eye fixed on him now, no longer with doubt, but with reluctant recognition. They didn't want to bow, but their eyes bowed. They didn't want to be silent, but silence betrayed them. Elijah hadn't won with fists or arguments. He won by simply being undeniable. In his mind, a single thought rang clear. This isn't just about me. This is for everyone who was ever stopped at the door, dismissed where they belonged, forced to prove what should never need proving. This cut isn't mine alone, it is theirs too. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking, a sound like the period at the end of the play. He didn't need to speak again. Sometimes the greatest power is knowing when to stop and let others recognize their own defeat. And in that silence, Elijah knew the battle was finished. But the tremor it caused would ripple outward, through the bank, and far, far beyond. The heavy doors of the bank closed behind Elijah with a dull thud, as if sealing shut an entire chapter of doubt and contempt. He stepped outside, sunlight spilling across the pavement, so bright it felt unlike an ordinary afternoon. The light caught on his dark suit, making his figure stand out as the crowd instinctively parted to either side. His shoes struck the marble steps in steady rhythm, each beat louder, clearer than the city noise beyond. A few pedestrians paused, eyes widening at the man emerging from those gleaming glass doors. They had no idea what had happened inside, but they felt something different in the air. A weight clinging to him, spreading outward like an unseen tide. Elijah lifted his face to the sky. Strange, he thought. The city's sky had never looked this clear. Maybe it was an illusion, or maybe it was only the stark contrast with the suffocating air of the room he had just left. In that ordinary afternoon, everything seemed to slow, as if time itself were pausing to witness his steps. Inside the bank, silence still pressed on heavy and raw, eyes darting but lips refusing sound. Outside where Elijah walked, that silence leaked beyond the marble walls. It became something else, a resonance that made even the busy street feel hushed for a moment. A paperboy on the corner froze, the stack of newspapers still in his hand, staring at Elijah like he had just stepped out of the very headlines. A middle-aged woman nearly collided with him, then instinctively stepped aside, her eyes holding a quiet respect she couldn't name. They didn't know his name, didn't know what declaration had just been made inside. But somehow they sensed it. A reversal had just taken place, and this black man was its center. Elijah said nothing. He didn't look back. He simply walked forward, unhurried, letting the echo of his steps do the rest. Because he understood. Sometimes no explanation is needed. Silence is the sharpest weapon. The blue sky above was no longer just scenery. It was a mirror, reflecting the man who had just walked out of a place that once denied him. In that light, Elijah felt a kind of peace. Not because he had won, but because the truth had spoken for itself, louder than any argument could. And in crossing that threshold from shadow into light, the silence no longer belonged to that bank alone. It became aftershock, spreading outward, through whispered retellings, through startled glances, through hearts long conditioned to doubt. Elijah knew the battle inside the bank was finished, but the echo was only beginning. Inside, the silence lingered like a song, cut short on its final note. No more chuckles, no more snide whispers. Only lowered eyes fixed on the cold marble floor, as if afraid that lifting them would mean staring directly into the truth. The receptionist, once eager to twist every word to keep him out, now sat trembling at her keyboard, fingers tapping nonsense. The branch manager, who had boldly called headquarters to sound the alarm, stood red-faced and wordless. The guards, men who had planted themselves in his path, now shifted uneasily as if realizing they had been standing on the wrong side all along. No one needed to say it. They all understood. The barrier they had built had been broken down, not by rage, but by a truth too heavy to deny. In one corner, the white customer who had sneered that Elijah must be an Uber driver lost his way, now kept his head bowed. He clumsily folded his newspaper, the pages betraying him like evidence. Those who had laughed now found the silence choking. Their laughter had never been joy. It had been confidence that they'd never have to face this truth. But the truth now sat on the table. Undeniable. The bank's acquisition papers, heavier than gold, still lay there like a mirror too large to escape. And in that mirror they saw their own distorted faces. Arrogant, biased, small. A young employee pressed back against the wall, swallowed hard. He whispered to a colleague, his voice trembling as though afraid to be heard. "We were wrong from the start." His colleague didn't answer, just nodded, eyes fixed on the ground, as if begging the earth to swallow him whole. Outside, Elijah was already gone, leaving behind a glittering bank, hollowed out by silence. No laughter remained, and it was that absence, the lack of sound, that became unbearable. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it gnawed at them, slow and merciless. An older customer waiting for his turn shook his head. His sigh filled the room, and in it was a confession. They had laughed in the wrong place, trusted the wrong people, misjudged from the very moment Elijah had walked in. No one spoke. No one dared apologize. Because to apologize meant admitting that, at the crucial moment, they had bowed to prejudice instead of standing for truth. And so the room stayed silent. A silence so thick it clung to every skin. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was a verdict. A verdict Elijah never needed to read aloud. He continued down the sidewalk, his pace steady, unhurried. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had been left inside, not in speeches or shouts, but in the truth laid down at the exact right moment. In his heart, one thought rang as clear as a bell. The sharpest answer is not a scream, but silence that knows its place. He had nothing more to prove. The silence of those who had doubted spoke louder than any argument he could have made. Old memories flickered. Childhood days when his mother was shoved out of stores under false suspicion. Back then, Elijah had wondered why she hadn't protested, why she hadn't shouted. Now he understood. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it is pride. Sometimes it is the lasting mark that lingers far longer than words. An argument can be forgotten, but silence at the right moment, it haunts. Faces replayed in his mind. The bowed receptionist, the tight-lipped manager, the retreating guards. Together they formed a single image, the suffocation of people cornered by a truth too heavy to escape. Elijah smiled faintly. He hadn't needed to teach them a lesson. They had taught it to themselves. And he knew the silence would not stay in those walls. It would ripple outward through evening whispers at home, through retellings over dinner tables, through the wary glances the next time a black man walked into a bank. That silence would become a bell, tolling again and again, until people had no choice but to change the way they looked at others. On the crowded street, Elijah felt lighter. Not triumphant, but settled as a man who had closed a circle. He had once been turned away from doors. Now he walked out on his own, no longer the outcast, but the one who left a mark. He lifted his head. The sky remained impossibly blue. For a heartbeat, the whole city seemed hushed, as if listening to the echo of truth carried in his footsteps. And the story ended there, not with a slammed fist or a shouted word, but with a resounding silence. A silence that forced everyone who had witnessed it to confront themselves. Because sometimes silence is the loudest voice of all. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.